Out here, survival usually means taking what you can get. But when a rugged, solitary mountain man watched a desperate woman turn down 3 paying jobs in a single afternoon, he had to ask, "What exactly are you looking for?" Her answer changed both their lives forever. The frontier town of Oak Haven, Wyoming Territory, smelled of coal smoke, stale beer, and desperate ambition. It was the autumn of 1884, and the harsh winter winds were already threatening to howl down from the high peaks. Gideon Callahan stood near the hitching post outside McCormick's Mercantile, quietly securing 50 pounds of flour, salt, pork, and coffee to the back of his pack mule. Gideon was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited. Broad-shouldered, quiet, his face weathered by sun and snow, half hidden beneath the brim of a battered leather hat, and a thick, dark beard. He had lived up on Bitterroot Ridge for 5 years, preferring the honest brutality of the mountains to the deceitful nature of civilized men. He only came down to Oak Haven twice a year. He hated the noise, the crowds, and the constant scheming. Yet, as he pulled the diamond hitch tight across his supplies, his sharp eyes caught a disruption in the usual flow of the dusty street. Her name was Eleanor Stanton, though Gideon wouldn't know that until later. What he noticed first was her posture. In a town where most people walked with their heads down against the wind or hunched over their own secrets, she walked with a ramrod straight spine. She wore a dark blue wool dress that was meticulously clean but visibly fraying at the cuffs and hem. Her face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion, and her steps had the brittle carefulness of someone who hadn't eaten a full meal in days. Gideon paused his packing, leaning against the wooden railing. He was a trapper and a hunter. Observing the behavior of creatures was how he stayed alive. Right now, this woman was the most fascinating creature in Oak Haven. He watched her stop in front of the Brass Lantern Saloon. It was a notoriously rough establishment owned by Hiram Belden, a man whose reputation was as greasy as his slicked-back hair. Eleanor took a deep breath, smoothing her skirts, and pushed through the swinging batwing doors. The afternoon was quiet enough that Gideon, standing just 20 yards away, could hear the heavy thud of a glass on the bar and Belden's booming, abrasive voice. "I need a server, sure." Belden's voice drifted out into the street. "But the girls here, they gotta be friendly. You understand? The miners come in lonely. You pour the whiskey, and you keep 'em company upstairs if they pay right. $5 a week, plus whatever tips you earn on your back." Gideon felt his jaw tighten. He expected the desperate woman to fold, to cry, or to reluctantly agree. Instead, the doors swung open a moment later. Eleanor stepped out. She didn't run, and she didn't weep. She turned back to the doorway and delivered a response so chillingly composed it cut through the street noise. "My labor is for sale, Mr. Belden. My dignity is not. I suggest you find another woman to stock your inventory." She walked away, leaving Belden sputtering curses from the porch. Gideon found himself unconsciously nodding in respect. She was starving, but she wasn't broken. He continued to watch as she made her way down the boardwalk, her boots clicking softly against the warped pine planks. She stopped next at Pettigrew's Fabrics. Gideon knew the owner, a sour, iron-fisted widow named Martha Gable who ran a sweatshop in the back room, employing desperate women to sew canvas tents and heavy canvas trousers for the silver miners. Gideon decided his saddlebags needed adjusting. He led his mule slowly down the street, keeping pace with Eleanor's progress, stopping outside the open window of the fabric shop. Inside, the rhythmic, deafening clatter of 4 sewing machines echoed. Mrs. Gable was barking orders. "You'll work from 6 in the morning until 8 at night," the widow snapped, looking Eleanor up and down with intense disdain. "Sunday mornings off for church, back to the wheel by noon. I pay 50 cents a day. You break a needle, it comes out of your pay. You miss a stitch, it comes out of your pay. Do we have an understanding? 50 cents a day for 14 hours of bone-crushing, eye-straining labor. It wouldn't even cover the cost of a safe room at the local boarding house, let alone food." "I am a skilled seamstress, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor replied, her voice steady but laced with a heavy weariness. "But those hours will leave me no time to care for my family at home, and the wages will not feed us. I cannot accept those terms." "Then starve in the street," Mrs. Gable hissed. Plenty of girls off the Omaha rail line begging for that seat. Then I leave it to them, Eleanor said, stepping back out into the harsh sunlight. Gideon paused, his hand resting on the neck of his mule. He had seen strong men break under the weight of this town in a matter of hours. Yet this woman, fragile as a porcelain cup and clearly drowning in poverty, had just turned down her second chance at survival in less than 20 minutes. The mystery of her was digging into him like a splinter. She mentioned family. A husband, perhaps? But she wore no ring, and no husband worth his salt would let a woman looking that frail pound the boardwalks looking for pennies. By now, Gideon had abandoned any pretense of running errands. He trailed her from a respectful distance as she crossed the dusty thoroughfare, dodging a passing freight wagon, and approached the Oak Haven assayer's office. This was a respectable brick building. The owner, Horace Dunlap, was a man of supposed high standing, a deacon at the church, and a prominent figure in the local bank. Gideon waited by the telegraph office next door, striking a match against the heel of his boot to light a hand-rolled cigarette. He leaned against the brickwork, watching through the large glass window of the assayer's office. Inside, Horace Dunlap was smiling a predatory politician's smile. He handed Eleanor a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Gideon watched her eyes scan the pages. She was fast. Her eyes darted over the columns of numbers, her brow furrowing. She flipped a page, then another, her finger tracing the ink lines. Even through the glass, Gideon could see the exact moment her expression shifted, from hopeful to horrified. "Mr. Dunlap," Eleanor said, her voice carrying through the slightly open transom window above the door. "These ore purity figures, they don't match the payout receipts on the opposite page. You're logging high-grade silver yields but paying the independent miners for low-grade slag. The discrepancy it's enormous." Dunlap's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice, though not enough to escape Gideon's sharp ears. "You have a sharp eye, Miss Stanton. Very sharp. That's exactly why I need a smart clerk. You keep the books looking pretty. Make sure those numbers stay complicated enough that the illiterate miners don't ask questions, and I'll pay you $10 a week. A very comfortable living for a single woman." He was asking her to be an accomplice to grand larceny. It was the most lucrative offer she had received all day. $10 a week was a fortune out here. Eleanor slowly closed the heavy ledger. The silence stretched for an agonizing moment. Gideon held his breath, wondering if this would be the breaking point. Starvation had a way of eroding morals, of making theft look like survival. "My father was an accountant, Mr. Dunlap," Eleanor said quietly. "He taught me that numbers are the only things in this world that never lie. Only the men who write them do." She pushed the book across the counter. "I will not be a thief for you." She turned and walked out before Dunlap could even react. When the door shut behind her, the last of her adrenaline seemed to evaporate. Her shoulders slumped, the ramrod-straight spine finally bowing under the crushing weight of reality. She walked a few dozen yards down the boardwalk and collapsed onto a weathered oak bench outside the closed bank. She buried her face in her hands. She didn't cry. Gideon sensed she was too dehydrated and exhausted for tears, but her chest heaved with silent, jagged breaths. Gideon dropped his cigarette, grinding it out beneath his heel. He didn't know what drove him to step forward. He avoided people. He despised entanglement. But he couldn't walk away. He approached the bench slowly, his heavy boots making deliberate thuds on the wood so as not to startle her. He stopped a few feet away, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. Eleanor looked up, flinching slightly. Her eyes, a striking shade of tempest gray, widened at the sight of the giant mountain man cloaked in bear fur and worn leather. Gideon removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly deep and gentle, like distant thunder. "I don't mean to intrude on your peace, but I've been watching you for the better part of an hour." Eleanor stiffened, instantly defensive. "If you're here to offer me an insult or a proposition, sir, I suggest you save your breath." "Neither," Gideon said, taking a slow step back to give her space. "But I watched you walk into the Brass Lantern, Pettigrew's, and Dunlap's office. I saw you turn down 3 paying jobs in a town where people kill for a silver dime. You look like you haven't eaten a square meal since Tuesday. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "So, I have to ask, what exactly kind of work are you looking for?" Eleanor stared at him, hostility battling with sheer exhaustion. "Work that doesn't require me to sell my body, surrender my every waking hour, or risk a trip to the territorial prison," she snapped back. "Is that so unreasonable? Out here?" "Usually," Gideon said honestly. "But you mentioned a family to Mrs. Gable. I don't see a husband." "There is no husband," Eleanor said fiercely, clutching her frayed reticule. "It is just me and my younger brother, Samuel. We came out here on the promise of a teaching position that evaporated the day we arrived." She looked away, staring at the dust swirling in the street. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once. "Samuel, he isn't like other boys. He had a severe fever when he was an infant. He is completely deaf, and he cannot speak. In a city back east, there are institutions. Out here," she swallowed hard, "out here, they look at him like an animal. If I take the saloon job, we live above a brothel. If I take the sewing job, I leave a vulnerable deaf boy alone in a dangerous town for 14 hours a day. And if I cook the books for Dunlap and get caught, I go to prison, and Samuel ends up dead in an alley." She looked back up at Gideon, a fierce protective fire reigniting in her gray eyes. "So, sir, if you have a job that provides a roof, an honest wage, and safety for a brother who cannot hear a rattlesnake's warning, I will take it. If not, I bid you good day." Gideon stood perfectly still, the wind rustling the thick fur of his coat. He thought of his cabin up on Bitterroot Ridge. It was isolated, 20 miles from the nearest corrupt politician or sleazy saloon owner. It was surrounded by an unforgiving wilderness, but it was secure. He had built it to withstand avalanches and grizzly bears. He made his living running trap lines over 50 square miles of brutal terrain, often gone for a week at a time. Every winter he lost half his pelts to rot or scavengers because he didn't have someone at the base camp to smoke the meat, stretch the hides, and keep the fires burning. It was an insane idea. A delicate, educated city woman and a disabled boy trying to survive an alpine winter. "I have a cabin," Gideon heard himself say, the words slipping out before his solitary nature could stop them, 20 miles up the mountain. "It's a hard life. The snow gets 10 feet deep, and the closest neighbor is a pack of timber wolves." Eleanor stopped breathing, staring at him. "I run trap lines," Gideon continued, stepping closer. "I'm gone, days at a time. I need someone to tend the smokehouse, keep the cabin secure, and organize my ledger, because unlike Mr. Dunlap, my numbers are honest, but my handwriting is terrible." He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a leather pouch, dropping a heavy gold double-eagle coin onto the bench beside her. "I'll pay you $20 a month, room and board included. Your brother stays safe in the cabin. No one comes up that ridge without me knowing it." Eleanor looked at the $20 gold piece. It was more money than she had seen in 6 months. She looked back up at the imposing, scarred face of the mountain man. He was a stranger, and stepping into the wilderness with him was a massive risk. But looking into his eyes, she saw none of the predatory greed of Hiram Belden, none of the cruel exploitation of Martha Gable, and none of the deceit of Horace Dunlap. She saw only a vast, quiet honesty. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice trembling for the first time. "Gideon. Gideon Callahan." Eleanor took a deep breath, picking up the gold coin. It was heavy, warm, and real. "I will need to fetch Samuel from the boarding house, Mr. Callahan. How soon do we leave?" The boarding house at the edge of Oakhaven was a dilapidated structure that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp rot. When Gideon Callahan stepped inside behind Eleanor Stanton, his broad shoulders practically brushed the doorframes. Waiting in a dimly lit, cramped room was Samuel. The boy was 12 years old, thin as a willow branch, with the same tempest-gray eyes as his sister. When the door opened, Samuel didn't turn at the sound. He only reacted when the floorboards vibrated beneath Gideon's heavy boots. The boy scrambled backward against the peeling wallpaper, his hands coming up in a defensive posture. Eleanor immediately rushed forward, her hands moving in rapid, fluid gestures, a makeshift sign language they had developed over the years. Samuel's eyes darted to the towering mountain man, then back to his sister. He signed something back, his expression a mix of fear and desperate hope. I told him we are leaving, Eleanor said softly, turning to Gideon. I told him you offered us safe harbor. He wants to know if there are wolves. Tell him yes, Gideon replied, his voice a low rumble. Tell him the wolves stay outside, and we stay inside. And tell him he's going to learn how to shoot a Winchester. When Eleanor translated this, a slow, cautious smile spread across Samuel's face. For a boy who had spent his life being treated as an invalid or an idiot by civilized society, the promise of a rifle was the highest form of respect. Within the hour, they were on the trail. The journey up to Bitterroot Ridge was a grueling, bone-jarring ascent. The wagon trail ended 5 miles outside of town, forcing them to switch to a narrow, treacherous switchback path. Gideon led the pack mule, his massive strides eating up the steep terrain, while Eleanor and Samuel followed. The physical toll on Eleanor was immediate. Her city boots, already worn, offered little protection against the jagged shale and freezing mud. By the second hour, her feet were bleeding. By the fourth, her lungs burned in the thinning altitude, and her legs trembled so violently she could barely stand. Yet, every time Gideon paused and looked back, fully expecting to hear a plea for rest or a tearful demand to turn around, he found her jaw set, holding Samuel's hand, putting one foot in front of the other. She never complained, not once. They breached the tree line just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and crimson. There, nestled in a protected notch against a sheer granite wall, sat Gideon's cabin. It was larger than Eleanor expected, built of massive, hand-hewn lodgepole pines, with a steeply pitched sod roof designed to shed heavy snow. A stone chimney smoked a welcoming greeting, and a separate, sturdy outbuilding served as a smokehouse and pelt shed. "We're here," Gideon announced, pushing the heavy oak door open. The interior was Spartan, but impeccably clean. Cast iron pans hung near the massive hearth. A sturdy table sat in the center, and 2 separate sleeping areas were partitioned by heavy canvas dropcloths. It smelled of wood smoke, tanned leather, and dried sage. It was the smell of survival. The first month on the mountain was a brutal education for Eleanor. Gideon was a man of few words, teaching her the harsh realities of frontier life through demonstration rather than lecture. He showed her how to skin a rabbit without puncturing the gallbladder, how to render animal fat down into lye soap, and how to stretch beaver pelts on willow hoops so they wouldn't rot. Her hands, once accustomed to holding fountain pens and teacups, became calloused and scarred. She broke her nails, burned her wrists on the cast-iron stove, and wept from sheer exhaustion when Gideon was away checking his trap lines. But she refused to quit. The transformation in Samuel, however, was nothing short of miraculous. Freed from the cruel taunts of the town, the mountain became his sanctuary. Without the distraction of sound, the boy's visual and tactile senses were razor-sharp. Gideon recognized this immediately. Instead of treating Samuel like a burden, the mountain man treated him like an apprentice. Gideon taught the boy to read animal tracks, to feel the barometric pressure dropping before a storm, and to communicate through a complex series of hand signals used by the Shoshone tribes, which Gideon had learned years prior. One evening in late November, the wind howling violently against the log walls, Eleanor sat at the table working on the ledger Gideon had promised her. The mountain man sat by the fire, silently whittling a piece of cedar, while Samuel slept soundly in his cot. "Your numbers are a mess, Mr. Callahan," Eleanor said, a teasing lilt in her voice that hadn't been there a month ago. "You've been undercharging the trading post in Cheyenne by at least 15% on your winter fox pelts." Gideon paused his knife, looking up at her. The firelight danced across her face. The pale, fragile city girl was gone. In her place was a woman with a sun-kissed flush to her cheeks, wearing one of his old flannel shirts over her dress, her hair braided practically down her back. She looked fiercely beautiful. "I'm a trapper, Miss Stanton, not a banker," he replied quietly. "Well, you have an accountant now," she said, closing the book. She looked down at her hands, the rough calluses visible in the lantern light. "I never thanked you, Gideon, for pulling us out of that town. You earned your keep," he stated simply. "You work harder than any man I've hired." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have learned to trust each other entirely. But the peace of the mountain was an illusion. and the sins of Oakhaven were crawling up the ridge. The first massive blizzard of the season hit in early December, burying Bitterroot Ridge beneath 4 feet of blinding white snow. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, encasing the cabin in a fortress of ice. They were effectively cut off from the world, relying on the stockpile of venison, dried beans, and flour they had secured. For 2 weeks, the isolation brought Gideon and Eleanor closer. They spent long evenings by the fire. Gideon found himself talking more than he had in 5 years, sharing stories of his youth in the Shenandoah Valley, while Eleanor spoke of her father's strict but loving home in Boston. The unspoken tension between them shifted from the awkwardness of strangers to a deep, resonant yearning. There was no room for courtship on the frontier. There was only shared survival, and in that survival, an unbreakable bond was forging. But on the morning of December 18th, the sky finally cleared, revealing a blindingly bright, frozen world. Gideon strapped on his snowshoes, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and went out to check the perimeter and clear the smokehouse roof. He returned an hour later, kicking the snow from his boots with violent force. The relaxed demeanor he had cultivated over the past month was gone, replaced by the deadly, predatory tension of a cornered wolf. Eleanor dropped the shirt she was mending. "What is it? A bear?" "Worse," Gideon said, moving to the gun rack and pulling down a double-barreled shotgun, tossing a handful of buckshot shells onto the table. "Men, 3 of them. They came up the eastern draw. They're trying to stay in the tree line, but they don't know how to mask their tracks in deep powder." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Who would come up here in this weather? Gideon looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "When you looked at Horace Dunlap's ledger that day, did you read the dates and the claim numbers, or just the totals?" Eleanor gasped, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. I read the claim numbers. My father trained me to memorize columns to double-check my own work. I saw the lot numbers for the Silver Queen and the Lucky Strike mines. "Dunlap has been stealing from the most dangerous men in the territory," Gideon growled, loading the shotgun with terrifying efficiency. "If the miners find out, they'll hang him from the assayer's sign. He must have realized you saw enough to ruin him. You're the only loose end." "He sent men to kill me?" Eleanor whispered, her hands trembling. "They have to get through me first," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. He quickly signed to Samuel, who had woken up and was watching them with wide eyes. Gideon pointed to the heavy oak table, then to the floor behind the cast-iron stove. "Hide. Stay low." Samuel nodded, moving swiftly to the safest corner of the cabin, clutching the wooden carving Gideon had made him. "Eleanor," Gideon said, handing her a Colt revolver. "You know how to use this. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you empty it into their chest. Do you understand?" "Where are you going?" she asked, panic edging into her voice. "They think I'm trapped in here. I'm not going to let them dictate the battlefield." Gideon slipped out the back window, dropping silently into the deep snowdrift behind the cabin. Inside, the silence became deafening. Eleanor knelt beside Samuel, holding the heavy revolver, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Minutes stretched into hours. The wind howled, masking any sound of approach from the outside. Suddenly, Samuel's head snapped up. He wasn't listening, he was feeling. He pressed his palms flat against the rough wooden floorboards. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes wide with urgency, and held up 2 fingers. 2 men, on the front porch. Eleanor leveled the revolver at the front door just as the heavy oak splintered. A boot kicked the latch, and the door flew open, letting in a swirl of blinding white snow and freezing air. 2 men stood in the doorway. They were hardened killers from the valley, one wearing a heavy buffalo coat, the other a scarred man with a shotgun. They stepped into the dim cabin, their eyes adjusting to the gloom. "Well, well," the scarred man sneered, spotting Eleanor in the corner. "Mr. Dunlap said you were a pretty little thing. Shame it has to end like this." He raised his weapon. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger of the heavy Colt. The recoil violently kicked her arm back, and the thunderous retort filled the small room. The bullet caught the scarred man in the shoulder, spinning him backward into the snow. The second man cursed, drawing his pistol, but before he could aim, A massive shadow dropped from the roof of the porch directly behind him. Gideon Callahan moved with a terrifying, primal speed. He didn't use a gun. He swung the heavy wooden handle of his splitting maul, striking the man in the buffalo coat squarely in the chest. The terrifying crack of ribs echoed over the wind, and the man collapsed instantly. The scarred man, bleeding heavily in the snow, tried to raise his weapon toward Gideon. A shot rang out from the tree line, the third man, providing cover fire. The bullet grazed Gideon's thigh, tearing through the leather and drawing blood. Gideon ignored the pain, diving behind the heavy cord of stacked firewood on the porch. "I've got you pinned, Callahan," the third man shouted from behind a large pine tree 50 yards away. "Give up the girl, and maybe I let you bleed out in peace." Gideon gritted his teeth, pressing a hand to his bleeding leg. He was trapped behind the woodpile. If he leaned out to shoot, the man in the trees would take his head off. Inside the cabin, Eleanor saw Gideon bleeding through the open doorway. Fear for herself vanished, entirely consumed by a fierce, desperate rage to protect the man who had protected her. She looked at Samuel. The boy had crawled to the side window, slightly parting the canvas curtain. He was tracking the muzzle flash from the trees. Samuel looked at Eleanor and pointed toward a specific gap in the pines. He then held up his hands, mimicking the trajectory of a rifle sight, and adjusted it slightly to the left. Eleanor understood. She crawled to the window, resting the barrel of the Colt on the sill. She couldn't see the man, but she trusted her brother's eyes implicitly. She aimed exactly where Samuel indicated, took a breath, and fired 2 blind shots into the brush. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the woods. The third man dropped his rifle, clutching his shattered knee, tumbling out of his cover and into the deep snow. Gideon didn't waste a second. He emerged from behind the woodpile, leveling his shotgun at the wounded man in the snow, then turning it on the bleeding man on the porch. "Drop it!" Gideon roared, his voice echoing off the mountain peaks. The remaining fight drained out of the hired guns. They dropped their weapons, groaning in the freezing snow. Gideon breathed heavily, the adrenaline slowly leaving his system. He limped into the cabin, shutting the splintered door against the cold as best he could. He looked at Eleanor, still kneeling by the window with the smoking revolver, and Samuel, who was giving a thumbs up. Gideon sank into one of the wooden chairs, tying a crude tourniquet around his leg. He looked up at the woman standing before him. The fragile seamstress from Oakhaven was gone forever. "You're a terrible shot, Miss Stanton," Gideon said, a faint, exhausted smile touching his lips. "But your brother makes a hell of a spotter." Eleanor rushed to him, tearing strips of clean linen to bandage his wound, her hands shaking not from fear, but from relief. "I told you, Mr. Callahan," she whispered, looking up into his dark eyes. "My family earns our keep." The rest of the winter was a brutal test of endurance, but the dynamic within the cabin had irrevocably shifted. With Gideon confined to his bed for 3 weeks to let the bullet graze heal properly without infection, the survival of the household fell squarely onto Eleanor's shoulders. The city woman who had almost fainted on the ascent in November was now chopping firewood, hauling water from the frozen creek, and checking the snare lines closest to the cabin. Samuel was her shadow, his sharp eyes compensating for his lack of hearing, keeping them safe from the desperate, starving predators that prowled the deep snow. They locked the 2 surviving hired guns in the sturdy pelt shed, tossing them just enough jerky and snowmelt to keep them alive. The man with the shattered chest had not survived the night, and Gideon had buried him under a cairn of heavy stones. During those long, snowbound weeks, the quiet spaces between Gideon and Eleanor filled with something profound. One evening in late February, as the wind screamed a whiteout against the heavy log walls, Gideon watched her reading to Samuel by the firelight. Her hair was loose, catching the copper glow of the flames. "You belong down there, you know," Gideon said suddenly, his voice rough. "When the thaw comes, you take that ledger, you give it to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. He'll seize Dunlap's assets. There will be a reward, enough to buy a real house, a quiet life, schools for Samuel." Eleanor closed the book, her gray eyes locking onto his. She didn't look away, and she didn't blush. The mountain had stripped away her city timidness. A quiet life built on what, Gideon? The deceit of men in suits? "I have seen what civilization offers a woman without means and a boy without hearing. I prefer the honest cruelty of your winter." She walked over to his cot, her hands now calloused and strong, gently changing the dressing on his thigh. "Besides," she added softly, leaning in so close he could smell the sweet scent of dried sage in her hair, "who would keep your ledger from looking like a drunken bear wrote it?" Gideon reached up, his rough, scarred hand cupping her cheek. For the first time in his solitary life, the thought of an empty cabin terrified him. He pulled her down, and their kiss was like the mountain itself, wild, desperate, and undeniably real. Spring broke in late April. The bitter cold retreated, leaving behind rushing rivers of snowmelt and valleys blooming with Indian paintbrush. It was time to finish what Horace Dunlap had started. Gideon, fully healed, loaded the two miserable, half-starved mercenaries onto the pack mule. Eleanor carried the heavy leather ledger, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, while Samuel rode behind her, his Winchester rifle resting easily across his lap. The descent took twice as long due to the deep, treacherous mud, but they rode with the grim determination of an incoming storm. Oakhaven had grown softer during the winter, completely unaware of the bloody siege that had taken place above the clouds. It was a bustling Tuesday afternoon when Gideon Callahan's procession marched down Main Street. The townspeople stopped in their tracks. They stared at the giant mountain man leading two battered bound gunmen, but they stared even harder at the woman riding beside him. Eleanor Stanton no longer looked like a fragile, desperate seamstress. She sat tall in the saddle, wearing a buckskin jacket, a Colt revolver strapped to her hip, with the commanding presence of a queen. They didn't stop at the assayer's office. Gideon led them straight to the Miners' Union Hall, where the foreman of the Silver Queen Mine, a massive, no-nonsense Irishman, was holding a wage meeting. Gideon kicked the double doors open. "I brought you a gift from the mountain," he announced, his voice booming through the hall. He shoved the two hired guns forward. They collapsed on the floor, weeping and ready to confess to avoid the gallows. Eleanor stepped forward, unwrapping the ledger and slapping it onto the foreman's wooden table. "Horace Dunlap has been skimming 15% of your high-grade silver yields since last spring. He's been doctoring the payout receipts. When I discovered it, he sent these men to my home to murder me and my brother." The silence in the hall was absolute, followed immediately by a roar of betrayal and fury from 50 hardened silver miners. 10 minutes later, a mob descended on the assayer's office. Horace Dunlap, looking out his window and seeing the ghosts he thought he had buried in the snow, turned the color of old parchment. He tried to scramble out the back door, but Gideon was already there, blocking the alleyway like a physical wall of vengeance. Dunlap panicked, reaching for a silver-plated derringer hidden in his vest. Before his hand even cleared his pocket, a shot rang out. The derringer spun out of Dunlap's shattered hand. Up on the boardwalk, Samuel lowered his smoking Winchester, a fierce, protective scowl on his face. He pumped the lever, chambering another round with a terrifying click that needed no translation. The U.S. Marshal, arriving on the stagecoach from Cheyenne just in time to prevent a lynching, took Dunlap into federal custody. The town was turned upside down. The miners, grateful for the revelation, voted to award Eleanor a massive 10% finder's fee from the recovered funds, a sum that made her instantly wealthy. That evening, as the sun set over the dusty town of Oakhaven, Gideon stood by the hitching post, adjusting the straps on his pack mule. He looked out toward the high peaks of Bitterroot Ridge. He had a heavy pouch of gold in his saddlebag, enough to buy supplies for 3 winters. He felt a hand on his arm. Eleanor stood there, Samuel beside her. "The marshal says the bank will have my draft ready by morning," she said, looking up at his weathered face. "The mayor even offered me the position of head schoolmarm, now that they know I'm a woman of means." Gideon swallowed hard, his heart heavy. "You earned it, all of it. You're a rich woman now, Eleanor. You don't ever have to freeze or scrape by again." Eleanor smiled, a brilliant, breathtaking expression that outshone the Wyoming sunset. She reached up, taking his dusty hat off his head, and ran her hands through his thick, dark hair. "A town is just a place where people hide behind walls and lie to each other, Gideon," she whispered, stepping into his chest. "My family already has a home, and the traps aren't going to check themselves." Gideon wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her neck, knowing finally that the deepest wilderness wasn't a place on a map, but a life lived without the people you loved. Samuel, watching them, grinned, and signed a single decisive word: home. If this tale of frontier survival, unwavering courage, and a love forged in the unforgiving high country captured your heart, don't let the trail end here. Please click the like button, share this story with your fellow pioneers, and subscribe to our channel for more Wild West dramas. Your support keeps our campfire burning and helps us bring more thrilling historical romances to life. Hit the bell icon now